Imagine this for a moment. It is 1964, and deep beneath the mountains of the Soviet Union, a secret so closely guarded that it is classified higher than the entire Soviet nuclear weapons program is about to fail in the most catastrophic way possible. Picture this scene, a machine unlike anything ever attempted in the history of engineering and warfare. A nuclear-powered drilling machine, 35 meters long, made entirely from titanium, capable of boring through solid rock at speeds that would make modern tunnel-boring machines look like they were standing still. This machine was supposed to be the Soviet solution to American technological superiority. This machine was supposed to be their secret weapon, their asymmetrical advantage in a Cold War that they were slowly and systematically losing to superior American innovation, superior American engineering, and superior American scientific genius. But in 1964, something went catastrophically wrong. Deep underground in the Ural Mountains, at a depth of nearly 6 miles beneath the surface, this machine, called the Battle Mole, encountered a problem that no Soviet engineer could have predicted, no Soviet scientist could have solved, and no Soviet military strategist could have planned for. The reactor failed. And in that moment, in those depths, in that darkness, a thermonuclear explosion vaporized the entire machine and killed every single person aboard. The crew simply ceased to exist. The entire vehicle was obliterated. The tunnel collapsed in on itself, and the wreckage remains buried beneath thousands of meters of rock to this very day. A silent monument to Soviet ambition, Soviet desperation, and Soviet failure in the face of American technological dominance. This is the story of a weapon so audacious, so technologically ambitious, so completely beyond what any other nation on Earth would have dared to attempt, that it represents the ultimate expression of Cold War desperation. This is the story of how the Soviet Union, facing the reality that they were being left behind technologically by the Americans, invested billions of rubles into a secret weapons program that was even more classified than their nuclear arsenal. This is the story of how American scientists sitting in laboratories in Los Alamos, New Mexico, were already designing similar machines, but never finished them because they recognized the fundamental impracticality of the concept. And this is the story of how the Soviet Union discovered, too late, that throwing resources and scientific talent at an impossibly ambitious goal does not guarantee success. But more than anything else, this is the story of American technological and engineering superiority, a superiority so complete, so overwhelming, so absolutely undeniable that the Soviet Union could never quite catch up, no matter how much they spent, no matter how hard they tried, no matter how desperately they grasped at the idea of secret weapons that might somehow give them an advantage. The Americans had figured out that the battle mole concept, while theoretically possible, was practically impractical. The Americans had moved on to other challenges, other technologies, other weapons systems that actually worked and that made sense from a military perspective. But the Soviet Union remained convinced that somehow, through sheer determination and unlimited resources, they could make this impossible dream work. And then their dream exploded, literally 6 miles underground. And the Soviet leaders, shocked at the failure, stunned at the catastrophe, immediately canceled the entire program, destroyed all the documentation, and pretended the whole thing had never existed. To this day, nearly 60 years later, Russia will not officially confirm that the battle mole ever existed. Russia will not explain what happened. Russia will not acknowledge the crew that died. It is a secret wrapped in secrecy, buried in the deepest places of the earth, a monument to what happens when ambition exceeds capability and when desperation overrides common sense. To understand why the Soviet Union invested billions of rubles into the Battle Mole project, we have to understand the historical moment in which the decision was made. It is the early 1960s. The Cold War is intensifying. The Americans have successfully launched their space program and are on their way to putting a man on the moon. The Americans have developed intercontinental ballistic missiles that can deliver nuclear weapons anywhere in the Soviet Union. The Americans have superior submarine technology. The Americans have superior nuclear weapon design. The Americans have superior everything. Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, is looking for something, anything, that might give the Soviets an asymmetrical advantage. He wants a weapon that is so unexpected, so different from anything the Americans are thinking about, that it might shock them and provide an alternative path to military dominance. Khrushchev understands that the Soviet Union cannot out-innovate the Americans in conventional military technology. The Americans are simply better at engineering. The Americans have more resources. The Americans have better scientific infrastructure. The Americans have better educated scientists. The Americans have the advantage of a capitalist system that incentivizes innovation and that allows for rapid technological change. So Khrushchev looks around at the available technology, the available science, the available possibilities, and he encounters an idea that has been floating around in Soviet military circles for decades. What if the Soviets could dig beneath American territory and deploy weapons underground? The concept is not entirely new. In 1904, a Russian engineer named Pyotr Roskazov had proposed the idea of an underground drilling machine that could tunnel beneath enemy fortifications. In the 1930s, Soviet designers had experimented with primitive subterranean designs, but these early machines were mechanical, they were slow, they were inefficient, and they were never practical for military applications. But now, in the 1960s, with the advent of compact nuclear reactors, reactors that the Soviets had already proven could work in nuclear submarines, suddenly the battle mole concept becomes theoretically possible. A nuclear reactor could generate enough heat to melt rock. A nuclear reactor could provide enough power to drive the drilling mechanisms. A nuclear reactor could sustain the machine for extended periods without needing external supplies or external cooling systems. A nuclear reactor could make this nightmare vision of Soviet military strategists actually work. And so, in 1962, Khrushchev authorizes the program. The Soviet leadership commits resources on an enormous scale. The best Soviet scientists are assigned to the project. Scientists like Andrei Sakharov, one of the greatest nuclear physicists in human history, who is tasked with developing the propulsion system and the soil-crushing technology that will allow the machine to move through solid rock with unprecedented efficiency. The greatest Soviet engineers are brought in to design the machine. An entire underground facility in Gromovka, Ukraine, is constructed specifically for the purpose of building these battle mole machines. Access to this facility is more restricted than the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Fewer people know about it. Fewer people can even talk about it. This is a secret so complete, so absolute, that it makes the Soviet atomic program look public by comparison. And Khrushchev believes, he genuinely believes, that this machine, this battle mole, will give the Soviet Union the asymmetrical advantage it desperately needs. He imagines Soviet submarines transporting these machines across the Atlantic, surfacing near California coast, depositing the battle moles into the shallow waters, and then watching as the machines bore deep beneath American soil to destroy American military installations. He imagines that the battle moles could reach American ICM silos, American command bunkers, American communication centers, all without being detected, all without any warning, all without the Americans ever knowing what hit them. He imagines that the Soviet Union could use these machines in California's seismically unstable regions to plant nuclear charges that, when detonated, would trigger massive earthquakes and tsunamis that would appear to be natural disasters, but would actually be the result of Soviet military operations. It is an audacious vision. It is a dangerous vision. It is a vision that reveals the absolute desperation of the Soviet leadership as they watch American technological superiority grow and grow with each passing year. It is a vision that shows the willingness of the Soviet Union to pursue weapons that are theoretically possible but practically improbable. And it is a vision that will ultimately lead to the catastrophic failure in the Ural Mountains. If you want to understand just how ambitious this project was, you have to understand the engineering challenges that the Soviet designers had to solve. The battle mole was not a simple machine. It was, in fact, one of the most complex vehicles ever attempted by any nation at any time in history. The Soviet engineers had to solve problems that had never been solved before. They had to innovate in ways that had never been necessary before. They had to push the boundaries of what was thought possible. The first challenge was designing a pressure vessel that could withstand being thousands of meters beneath the surface of the Earth. The pressure at a depth of 10 kilometers is literally thousands of times greater than atmospheric pressure. A human body cannot function at those depths. Water pressure at that depth would crush a submarine like it was made of aluminum foil. The Soviet engineers had to design a hull that could withstand these pressures while still being light enough to move through the rock. They chose titanium, an extraordinarily expensive material, but one of the strongest materials known to science, with an exceptional strength-to-weight ratio. The entire hull of the battle mole was constructed from titanium. The second challenge was designing a drilling apparatus that could actually bore through solid rock at speeds that would make the machine practical for military purposes. Modern tunnel boring machines, with all the advantage of decades of technological development and modern engineering, can bore through rock at speeds of about 1 to 3 kilometers per hour, roughly 1 to 2 miles per hour. The Soviets wanted their battle mole to achieve speeds of 7 to 15 kilometers per hour, roughly 4 to 9 miles per hour. This was 3 to 5 times faster than modern machines could achieve. It was an extraordinary goal. To accomplish this, the Soviet designers adopted a system called thermal boring. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of mechanically grinding away at the rock, the machine would use extreme heat to literally melt the rock face directly in front of it. The drill bit at the very front of the machine would be heated to temperatures between 1300 and 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the melting point of many metals, nearly as hot as the surface of some stars. This heat came from a compact nuclear reactor positioned in the center of the machine. The intense heat would melt the rock directly ahead of the machine. The forward momentum of the machine would push the molten rock to the sides of the expanding tunnel. And then, as the machine moved forward and away from the hot drill bit, the molten rock would cool and harden into a glass-like lining for the tunnel. The result would be a tunnel that was naturally reinforced as it was created, reducing the risk of cave-ins and providing structural stability for the entire passage. The third challenge was cooling the nuclear reactor while operating deep underground. In a nuclear submarine, the reactor is cooled by circulating seawater through cooling systems, but the battle mole would be thousands of meters beneath solid rock with no access to external water supplies. The Soviet engineers would have to design a closed-loop cooling system that recycled coolant internally, that generated enough cooling capacity to prevent reactor meltdown, that never failed, because if it failed, everyone aboard would die. It is a problem that the American scientists at Los Alamos, when they considered a similar concept years later, would ultimately decide was too difficult to solve in a practical way. And so they shelved the project. But the Soviet Union pressed forward, and in 1964, they built the machine. The project was led by some of the greatest scientific minds that the Soviet Union possessed. At the center of the effort was Andrei Sakharov, a physicist of extraordinary genius who would later become a dissident and a human rights advocate, but who at this time in his life was working at the highest levels of the Soviet nuclear weapons establishment. Sakharov was assigned the task of developing the propulsion system, the mechanism that would allow the battle mole to move through solid rock with unprecedented efficiency. Sakharov's solution involved what he called cavitation flow, a complex system of using pressure differentials and fluid dynamics to reduce friction around the moving machine, allowing it to slide through the rock more easily than would otherwise be possible. It was elegant, it was sophisticated, it required extraordinary mathematical analysis and physical understanding. Sakharov was a worthy challenger for such a problem. This was not a simple engineering task. This was a problem that required the kind of innovative, outside-the-box thinking that only the greatest physicists could provide. The project also involved Igor Kurchatov, the legendary Soviet nuclear physicist who had directed the entire Soviet nuclear weapons program. Kurchatov's involvement in the Battle Mole project, even at a supervisory level, indicated that the Soviet government considered this project to be extraordinarily important and extraordinarily secret. This was not a minor weapons program. This was not a side project. This was a major commitment of Soviet scientific and engineering resources. And at the political level, the project had the enthusiastic support of Nikita Khrushchev himself. Khrushchev was known for supporting ambitious, unconventional projects. The Soviet space program, for example, thrived under Khrushchev's support. Khrushchev was willing to spend enormous resources on weapons and technologies that were theoretically possible, even if they were practically problematic. The battle mole fit Khrushchev's preference for ambitious, unconventional approaches perfectly. So the best minds that the Soviet Union could assemble were focused on this project. The best engineers, the best scientists, the best mathematicians, the best designers, all working in secret, all working in an underground facility in Gromovka, Ukraine, all working with the knowledge that their project was more classified than the nuclear weapons program, all working with the understanding that the future of Soviet military superiority might depend on their success. They designed a machine that, on paper, seemed theoretically sound. They designed a machine that, in terms of pure engineering ambition, was extraordinary. They designed a machine that represented the very cutting edge of what Soviet science could accomplish. And then they built it. And then they tested it. And for the first two tests, the machine worked. The first test of the battle mole took place in 1964 in the suburbs of Moscow. The machine was lowered into a test tunnel. The nuclear reactor was activated, the drilling mechanisms engaged, and then something remarkable happened. The machine began to bore through the rock. It cut through hard rock like it was, in the words of witnesses, like a knife through butter. The machine moved smoothly. It drilled efficiently. The heating system worked. The propulsion system worked. The crew operations proceeded smoothly. The machine successfully bored through the rock and completed the test successfully. Soviet officials were astounded. They were impressed. They had doubted that the concept could actually be made to work, but here was physical proof that it could. Here was a machine that was doing something that no other nation on Earth could do. Here was a weapon that was, at least theoretically, completely unprecedented. At least theoretically, it represented a capability that the Americans did not possess. Additional tests were conducted in the Rostov region of southern Russia. These tests also went well. The machine demonstrated that it could bore through different types of rock. It showed that it could handle geological variations. It proved that the basic concept was sound and that the engineering had been done correctly. Soviet military officials began to believe that the project was actually going to succeed. They began to imagine the implications of the battle mole. They began to think about how this machine might change the balance of power in the Cold War. And so, in 1964, the Soviet Union authorized a final critical test. This test would take place in the Ural Mountains, specifically in a region near Nizhny Tagil, a major industrial city in the central Urals. The Ural Mountains are made of some of the hardest rock on Earth, granite, basalt, material that has resisted natural erosion for millions of years. If the battle mole could bore through the Ural Mountains, then it could bore through anything. If the battle mole could succeed in this final test, then the Soviet military would know that the weapon was ready for deployment. The machine was positioned. The crew, 5 members under the command of Colonel Semyon Budnikov, whether Budnikov was a real person or a cover name for security purposes, remains unclear to this day. The Soviet Union never officially confirmed his existence, never awarded medals to his family, never acknowledged any of the crew members who died. Some historians believe that Budnikov may have been a pseudonym used to protect the real identity of the commander from public disclosure. The reactor was activated. The machine began its test run. It bored deep into the Ural Mountains. According to available accounts, the machine performed magnificently. It cut through the hard rock of the Ural Mountains with remarkable efficiency. It bored more than 10 kilometers, more than 6 miles into the mountain. During the test, it successfully destroyed a dummy bunker, demonstrating that the machine had the capability to destroy underground military installations. For a few hours at least, it appeared that the Soviet Union was actually going to succeed with the Battle Mole project. It appeared that Khrushchev's ambitious vision was actually going to be realized. It appeared that the Soviet Union had, against all odds, created a weapon that was genuinely unprecedented. At least, theoretically, it represented a capability that the Americans did not possess. And then, something went catastrophically wrong. Deep beneath the Ural Mountains, at a depth of approximately 10 kilometers, approximately 6 miles beneath the surface, something happened inside the battle mole that was completely unexpected and completely catastrophic. The exact cause remains a mystery to this day. Was it a failure in the cooling system? Did the reactor overheat? Did some cooling fluid leak? Did the reactor core become unstable? Did the reactor lose its ability to maintain a controlled chain reaction? Or was it something else entirely? Did the machine become stuck in the rock? Did the forward momentum suddenly cease and the tunnel begin to collapse around the machine? Did the crew try to reverse or to navigate around an obstacle? Did something breach the hull? Did the pressure become too great? Did the titanium hull rupture? We may never know. The wreckage was never examined. The tunnel collapsed completely. The evidence was buried beneath tens of thousands of meters of rock. The truth died with the crew. But what happened next is absolutely clear. A thermonuclear explosion occurred deep underground. The nuclear reactor, which had been functioning normally throughout the entire test, suddenly either failed catastrophically or was triggered in some way by the events happening within the machine. And when a nuclear reactor fails deep underground, surrounded by rock, surrounded by a confined space, surrounded by pressure that is thousands of times greater than atmospheric pressure, the results are unimaginably violent. The explosion vaporized the entire machine. The battle mole simply ceased to exist. The titanium hull, which had been so carefully engineered, which had cost so much to design and construct, which had performed flawlessly during the previous tests, simply evaporated in the nuclear fireball. The tunnel that had been so carefully bored through the rock, that had taken so much effort and time to create, was completely collapsed by the force of the explosion. The rubble of rock fell into the void where the machine had been, and the crew, all 5 members, perished instantly. They were vaporized. They ceased to exist. There were no bodies to recover. There was no physical evidence that they had ever been there. There was only the collapsed tunnel and the destroyed machine, buried tens of thousands of meters beneath the rock. It is difficult to imagine a more catastrophic failure. It is difficult to imagine a more complete disaster. Here was a machine that had been designed by some of the greatest scientists in the Soviet Union.
Here was a weapon that had been the focus of billions of rubles of investment. Here was a vision of Nikita Khrushchev's that was supposed to give the Soviet Union an asymmetrical military advantage. And in an instant, in a location deep beneath the earth, it all ended. The machine exploded. The crew died. The project, from that moment forward, was effectively terminated. What happened in those final moments in the crew compartment of the battle mole remains unknowable. Did the crew understand what was happening? Did they have any warning? Did they try to reverse the machine? Did they try to shut down the reactor? Did they pray? Did they scream? Did they have any time to do anything at all before the explosion vaporized them? These questions will remain forever unanswered. Within days of the explosion in the Ural Mountains, the Soviet government sprang into action, not to rescue survivors, there were none, not to investigate the cause, that investigation, if it occurred at all, happened in the deepest secrecy, not to recover the wreckage, any recovery attempt would have been impossible at such depths and would have taken years. Instead, the Soviet government took a different approach. The Soviet government simply erased the entire project from history. All documentation related to the Battle Mole project was destroyed. Every blueprint, every calculation, every specification, every communication, everything that had been written down, everything that documented the project in any way was systematically destroyed. The facility in Gromovka, where the machines had been constructed, was repurposed for other projects or simply abandoned. All the scientists and engineers who had worked on the project were reassigned to other work. They were scattered to the winds. They were forbidden to talk about what they had done. They were threatened with everything from loss of their jobs to loss of their freedom if they ever revealed anything about the project. The crew of the Battle Mole was never officially acknowledged. Their names were never released. Their families were never informed. No medals were awarded. No commendations were given. No acknowledgement was ever made. In the official records of the Soviet Union, Colonel Semyon Budnikov and the 4 other crew members simply ceased to exist. They were ghosts. They were non-people. They had never existed as far as the Soviet government was concerned. And the timing of this was particularly interesting. Shortly after the explosion of the Battle Mole, Nikita Khrushchev was removed from power and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev had a different philosophy of weapons development. Brezhnev was more interested in conventional military strength, in matching American capabilities in proven weapon systems, in developing nuclear weapons that actually worked. Brezhnev had no interest in Khrushchev's ambitious, unconventional, experimental weapons programs. And so the Battle Mole project could be terminated, not just because it had failed catastrophically, but because it was associated with the discredited previous regime. The cover-up was so complete, so absolute, so total, that for nearly 2 decades after the explosion, nobody outside the highest levels of the Soviet military and political establishment knew that the Battle Mole had ever existed. The project disappeared. It was erased. It was as if it had never happened, as if the machine had never been built, as if the crew had never existed, as if the entire thing was just some kind of crazy dream that someone had imagined. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, when the Soviet system was beginning to collapse, that hints of the project began to emerge. Some researchers studying Soviet military history began to find vague references in declassified documents. Rumors began to circulate. Former Soviet officials, in their memoirs or in interviews, would make occasional references to the project. But detailed information remained scarce, unreliable, and difficult to verify. The Soviet Union, which could have set the record straight, steadfastly refused to acknowledge that the project had ever existed. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, even after the Cold War ended, even after the classification restrictions were supposedly loosened, Russia has never officially confirmed the Battle Mole project. Russia has never explained what happened. Russia has never released any documentation. Russia has never provided any official acknowledgement. The battle mole remains classified. The truth remains buried. What makes the Soviet failure of the battle mole even more striking is that the Americans, at nearly the same time, were considering very similar technology. In the 1970s, at Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory in New Mexico, American scientists and engineers were seriously examining the concept of nuclear-powered subterranean drilling machines. The Americans had the same idea: use heat from a nuclear reactor to melt rock, create tunnels through the earth at high speeds, and possibly use the technology for military or civilian purposes. In 1972, Los Alamos filed a patent for a nuclear subterranean tunneling machine, the American name for essentially the same technology that the Soviets were pursuing with the battle mole. The patent, number 3,693,732, described a machine that would use nuclear heat to bore through rock, create a glass-like lining as it went, and move through the earth with unprecedented speed. But then something remarkable happened. The American scientists at Los Alamos looked at the concept. They ran the calculations. They examined the engineering challenges. They considered the practical implications, and they reached a conclusion. While the concept was theoretically sound and scientifically interesting, it was not practically viable. The cooling requirements were too demanding. The heat loss would be too great. The cost would be astronomical. The advantages over existing technology would be minimal. The risks would be enormous. And most importantly, there was no clear military or civilian application that would justify the effort and expense. And so, the Americans did something that the Soviets could not do. The Americans killed the project. The Americans recognized that ambition is not sufficient. The Americans understood that just because something is theoretically possible does not mean it is practically advisable. The Americans had the wisdom and the humility to say, this is not going to work. This is not worth pursuing. We need to focus our efforts on technologies that actually make sense. And so the American nuclear subterranean project was abandoned. It never progressed beyond a patent and some theoretical studies. It never got built. It never got tested. It never killed anyone. By the 1980s, the entire American program had been shut down. The American scientists had moved on to other challenges, other technologies, other weapons systems that actually worked and that made practical sense. The contrast between the American and Soviet approaches is striking. The Americans had the expertise to design such a machine. The Americans had the resources to build it. But the Americans had something that the Soviets lacked: the wisdom to recognize a bad idea and to abandon it before massive resources were wasted and lives were lost. The Americans recognized that technological advancement and innovation are not ends in themselves. They are only worthwhile if they produce practical results. The Soviets, by contrast, pursued the battle mole with single-minded determination, even in the face of overwhelming practical and engineering challenges, even in the face of the fundamental questionability of the entire concept, even in the face of the risks. And when the project failed, the Soviets responded not by learning from the failure, not by improving the design, not by examining what went wrong, but by erasing the entire project from history and pretending it had never existed. The battle mole is, in many ways, a perfect example of the technological and philosophical differences between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The American approach was pragmatic, practical, focused on technologies that actually worked. The Soviet approach was ambitious, determined, focused on weapons that sounded impressive and that theoretically might work, even if the practical reality was questionable. And the American approach proved to be superior.
Nearly 60 years have passed since the explosion of the battle mole in the Ural Mountains, and yet fundamental questions remain unanswered. The first question is, did the battle mole actually exist? Some researchers remain skeptical that the entire machine was ever built. They point out the numerous implausibilities in the account. The speeds seem impossible. The engineering challenges seem insurmountable. The practical obstacles seem overwhelming. Some experts argue that while the Soviets may have seriously studied the concept and may have built experimental prototypes, they never successfully built a full-scale operational machine. Others argue that the battle mole is essentially a Cold War myth, a story that grew out of Soviet science fiction literature and that was exaggerated by historians and researchers eager to create a sensational tale about unconventional Soviet weapons. The legendary Soviet science fiction author Grigory Adamov wrote a novel called Conquerors of the Underground that described underground drilling machines, and some researchers argue that the modern battle mole story may be based on confusion between Adamov's fictional invention and actual Soviet military projects. However, the fact that multiple reliable sources mention the project, the fact that declassified Soviet and American documents do contain vague references to it, the fact that the project appears in accounts from people with apparent knowledge of Soviet weapons programs suggests that something did exist. Whether it was a fully functional machine or an ambitious but ultimately failed prototype remains unclear. The second question is, what exactly caused the explosion? The accounts describe a thermonuclear explosion, but there is no consensus on what caused it. Did the reactor cooling system fail? Did the reactor core become unstable? Did the machine become stuck in the rock, causing pressure to build? Did structural components fail? Did human error lead to the disaster? We may never know. The wreckage was never examined. The tunnel collapsed. The evidence was buried beneath tens of thousands of meters of rock. The truth remains unknown. The third question is, where is the wreckage? If the battle mole did explode in the Ural Mountains in 1964, the machine should still be there, buried under thousands of meters of rock. Could a future generation of geophysicists or miners potentially discover evidence of the machine? Some researchers have speculated about this possibility. Geophysical surveys might reveal an anomaly in the rock layers that could indicate a massive tunnel collapse at depth. Seismic data from 1964 might show evidence of an underground explosion, but to date, no such discovery has been made or publicly reported. The fourth and most telling question is, why has Russia never officially acknowledged the battle mole project or the disaster, even after the Cold War ended and many other secret Soviet programs were declassified and discussed? This is perhaps the most significant detail. If the battle mole had been built, tested, and then failed, you might expect that Russia would eventually acknowledge the project after the Cold War ended, just as Russia has acknowledged, discussed, and analyzed other failed weapons programs. But Russia has not done this. Russia maintains that the battle mole never existed. Russia refuses to provide documentation. Russia continues to classify information about the project. This mysterious silence, this complete refusal to acknowledge what apparently happened, suggests several possibilities. One possibility is that the project was so closely linked to Soviet nuclear weapons technology that Russia remains unwilling to provide details that might reveal sensitive information about their nuclear program. Another possibility is that the project was so phenomenally classified that even high-ranking officials who survived the Soviet collapse were unwilling or unable to provide official confirmation. A third possibility is that the entire story is more exaggerated than the facts actually support, and Russia is remaining silent because the truth is less sensational than the legend.
Or perhaps the truth is simply that the project failed so catastrophically, that the implications were so devastating, that the Soviet leadership decided that the best response was to erase it completely from history. Perhaps they concluded that acknowledging the project would be embarrassing. Perhaps they concluded that explaining the disaster would reveal too much about their technological limitations. Perhaps they concluded that the best path forward was to pretend the entire thing had never happened. The Battle Mole story, whether completely true or partly exaggerated or something in between, tells us something profound about the Cold War. It tells us about the technological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. It tells us about the ambitions and the insecurities of each superpower. It tells us about how far nations will go in pursuit of military advantage. The Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, was convinced that American technological superiority could be matched through sufficient investment, sufficient scientific talent, and sufficient determination. Khrushchev believed that Soviet science could accomplish anything: space travel, nuclear weapons, now underground drilling machines that could secretly attack America. This was the optimism of the Soviet system at its peak, the belief that a planned economy with unlimited resources could outpace and out-innovate a capitalist system. But the Battle Mole project revealed the fundamental limitations of this approach. Merely investing money and assigning talented scientists does not guarantee success. Merely pursuing an ambitious goal does not mean you will achieve it. Merely believing in the possibility of something does not make it practical or achievable. The Battle Mole taught this lesson in the most catastrophic way possible. The Americans, by contrast, showed greater pragmatism and wisdom. When American scientists at Los Alamos examined similar technology, they recognized the fundamental impracticality of the concept. They recognized that while the idea was theoretically interesting, it was not militarily or economically sensible, and they made the decision to abandon the project. This kind of pragmatism, the ability to recognize when an ambitious goal is actually not practical, the ability to move on from a promising idea if the real-world obstacles are too great, was perhaps an advantage that the American system possessed. The Battle Mole also tells us something about the nature of the Cold War competition. The competition was not just about who could build the biggest nuclear arsenal or the most advanced conventional weapons. The competition was also about who could imagine, design, and build the most outlandish, the most ambitious, the most unconventional weapons. The Cold War was, in some sense, a competition of ambition and imagination. And in that competition, both superpowers were willing to invest enormous resources in projects that were only marginally connected to practical military capability. But ultimately, the American system proved more resilient and more practical. The Americans could compete in ambitious, unconventional projects, but they could also make the pragmatism to abandon them when they became too impractical. The Soviet system seemed unable to do this. The Soviets would pursue ambitious projects to their conclusion, even if the conclusion was catastrophic failure, even if the entire project was a waste of resources, even if the practical military implications were questionable.
The Soviet combat mole stands as one of the most mysterious, most ambitious, most ultimately failed weapons programs of the Cold War. Whether it was a fully functional machine that was tested and destroyed in 1964, or whether it was primarily a conceptual project that never progressed beyond the planning stage, remains unclear even to this day. What we know is this: the Soviet Union seriously pursued the concept of a nuclear-powered underground drilling machine. The Soviets invested billions of rubles in the project. The Soviets assigned some of their greatest scientists, including Andrei Sakharov, to work on the project. The Soviets allegedly conducted tests of such a machine in 1964. According to the available accounts, one such machine allegedly exploded deep in the Ural Mountains, killing the entire crew and destroying the machine. After this alleged disaster, the Soviet Union immediately and completely abandoned the project, destroyed all documentation, and never officially acknowledged that it had ever existed. Whether the battle mole actually worked is a question that may never be definitively answered. Whether the explosion actually occurred is something that cannot be verified with the evidence available. Whether the crew members actually died is something that the Russian government has never confirmed. What we have instead are accounts from people who claim to have knowledge of the project, references in declassified documents, and the consistent pattern of Soviet secrecy and denial. But regardless of whether every detail of the story is accurate, the fundamental truth remains. The Soviet Union pursued this ambitious, impractical, ultimately questionable weapons program, and when it failed, either in testing or in some other way, the Soviets responded by erasing it from history. That pattern, that approach to failure, that willingness to invest enormous resources in weapons that had no practical military advantage, that determination to pursue ambitious technological goals, regardless of practical obstacles, these patterns are what the battle mole story reveals about the Soviet approach to Cold War competition. And the contrast with the American approach is striking. The Americans examined similar technology and decided that it was not practical. The Americans had the wisdom to abandon the project. The Americans recognized that American technological superiority did not depend on pursuing every theoretically possible idea, but rather on focusing resources and effort on weapons and technologies that actually worked and that made practical military sense. The battle mole remains what it has been for nearly 60 years, a mystery wrapped in secrecy, a Cold War legend that may or may not be true, a reminder that even with all the information we have access to today, some secrets of the past remain buried, perhaps literally in the mountains of Siberia, perhaps in classified archives that the Russian government refuses to declassify. But whether the battle mole actually existed or not, whether it actually exploded or not, whether the crew members actually died or not, one thing is certain. The story of the battle mole is a story of American technological and scientific wisdom, American pragmatism, and American superiority over Soviet ambition. It is a story that explains why, in the end, the American technological system proved to be more resilient, more practical, and more ultimately successful than the Soviet system, and it is a story that deserves to be remembered.